All right, ladies and gentlemen, in order to move on to your final draft, the things that you need to have sitting in front of you to get started are your thumbnail sketches, whichever one you've chosen. I think I'm going with my Hogwarts one, so I'm just folding this over so that all I'm looking at is the one that I've decided to move on with. I need a pencil. My pencil doesn't have an eraser, so I have one of my big erasers. You need some kind of device or a book or something that has your reference images in them, which I already have up here. So I've got my reference image, so I'm looking at that. And then you need a piece of paper. Now, this is a choice board assignment. So that means you have 3 choices after you've drawn your final. And what choice you're moving on with to your final kind of has to be based on what paper you have available. If all you have is computer paper or like the back of a worksheet, I would recommend moving on with the collage unit or the digital unit, because this paper is super light, and if you were trying to do watercolors on it, it's going to be really difficult. If you happen to have like mixed media drawing paper, or I happen to have watercolor paper, just because I do watercolors at home, so I do have watercolor paper. You will notice that watercolor paper is super thick. It's that way so that it can hold up to the water. If you want to try watercolor on computer paper, you can, but realize you might have some issues going forward. So if you don't have any kind of thicker, like drawing style paper, like think about the kind of paper we would use in class, you might want to go with collage or other or digital media. Either way, and I'm going to draw my digital one first. I'm eventually going to draw one on the watercolor paper too. But I'm going to draw this one for you guys. So, you are going to take your thumbnail. Now, you notice that on the thumbnail papers, just like we did in 6th grade, I did put these papers so you can kind of grid it out. So these lines are on here that can help you figure out where on the page it needs to be. Now, if you want to grid out your rough and you want to grid out your final, like you want to divide it up, you can do that. If you remember how to do that last year, or just kind of divide it up. Like if I look here, I can divide this in approximately thirds and divide this in approximately thirds. And then what goes in this box would go in this box. If you don't want to do that, that's okay, especially if your rough draft is really rough. What you do need to remember is that you need to have a foreground, middle ground, and background. I would recommend starting with your middle ground. So I am going to start, and I gotta pull up my image. There we go. So I'm going to look. So if I'm looking at this reference image, I'm kind of taking this piece of it. So I'm not copying the whole thing, and I'm not tracing it, but I've kind of got the castle back here. Now, because you are doing either digital design or you are doing collage with this, or you're doing watercolor. Either way, one reason why I picked all 3 of those is that it would be helpful. I have to set this so you guys can't see it. It's helpful to do this kind of simply. So if I look here, and also the nice thing about the rule of thirds is I can kind of think like my foreground should go in this kind of space, my middle ground should go here, and my background should go back up here. So I'm looking at my castle, and I want my castle is my middle ground. So what I'm going to do is very lightly at first, I am going to draw it in simple shapes. This will make it easier when you're going digitally or when you're going collage-wise to make it so that you can break things up. You don't have to have a super detailed drawing for this. Now I'm making this kind of look, I'm looking at my reference image and it kind of goes back, and actually, where's my eraser? So I'm going to draw this, and I'm not going to make you watch me draw all of this, but I'm kind of looking at how that goes back, and maybe I do some little artistic reference, and I add another, because I think in my Hogwarts castle, I want each of the corners to have a tower. Maybe this one's a little taller. So see how I'm just going in, lightly sketching. And you're going to draw out, and maybe this side, the wall's a little shorter. And it's got the doorway. So you don't want a whole lot of details. You want to keep it big so it's easy to work with. And then I say, okay, well, this is where the mountain comes down. And maybe I put another little tower back here. And I can always go back in and add like, oh, I want to have like the astronomy tower. I want to be super high behind it. Okay, so there's my middle ground. Then in mine, if I go back to my thumbnails, my foreground was some mermaids in the lake. So I'm going to kind of draw the lake going off the page down here. So it gives me some cropping. And so you can see down here, I'm adding the lake. And I'm going to add my mermaids. I'm going to keep them very simple. So they've got their heads. They've got their bodies. And they've kind of got their tails. So that's a simple shape that I can either color digitally, I can color using watercolors, or I can color. Yours can be a little bit more detailed, but you want to keep it simple. So I've got my mermaid in my foreground. I'll probably add another mermaid a little later. Maybe I'll add some rocks here at the edge. I also had Dumbledore's grave. I'm going to have to do some research because I don't have an image for that yet. But I'll kind of put myself a little marker that this is where I want Dumbledore's grave. So there I've got my foreground. I've got my middle ground. And one thing I am noticing in a lot of people's thumbnails is that your backgrounds aren't really going back behind. It's not just drawing, and I'll take this over here. If I'm drawing and I just draw like waves and then I draw a beach and then I draw sky, that's not foreground, middle ground, background. It's not really overlapping each other. So you want, like, if you wanted to do this kind of scene, you could have like a shark in the foreground, in the water, and then some people with their umbrellas, and then maybe mountains in the background. So see how the middle ground overlaps the background. The shark overlaps the middle ground. You want that overlapping is what's going to give things the illusion of going back in space. So my background is the mountains behind it. So I'm going to have like right around this third, I'm going to have like some mountains. I'm going to keep them kind of, actually that's looking more like trees. Maybe it's the forest that's back here. And so I give it like a ground line where the trees would end. So I know that these things are going to be trees. And then even behind the trees, I could do the big kind of hilly mountains. So I've got sky, I've got my background, I've got my middle ground, I've got my foreground. Now I'm going to sit down and take a little bit more time and get this a little bit more detailed before I move on to the next step. But that's your basics. You want to get all 3 levels. You want your levels to be basic shapes so that you can see and it's easy for you to cut and paste and color all of these spaces.